Hello and welcome to Colombia's Dairy Focus. In this episode, I would like to talk to you about an animal health concern that may be increasing in the country. It may affect your farm, or you may have never had any issues with, and it's called lungworm. Now, in recent years, those herds affected by lungworm may have noticed that it seems to be earlier and earlier in the year that cows show signs of this coughing caused by lungworm. And overall, the impression is that it may be starting earlier in the season, whereas it used to be much later in the summer. It's now starting early summer, or for some herds even late spring. Some of the underlying reasons could be an earlier start to the grazing season, maybe a tighter grazing or a higher stocking density. But first of all, before we jump to the conclusion of it being lungworm that's causing coughing in your cows, we need to make sure that we have ruled out other causes, such as maybe viruses like IBR or BRSV. Some herds have never had an issue with lungworm and all of a sudden it appears. In other herds, it's an annually recurring problem. So this type of coughing is quite typical for calves that experience their first bout of lungworm exposure in their first grazing season. And you will notice that they give one or two coughs, and especially when they're maybe a little bit more excited, let's say around feeding time like these calves. But you will notice in the older animals as well that the coughing is more clear when you're getting them in for milking, for example, in the morning or in the afternoon, when cows get up and start walking, or when there is a little bit of hustle and bustle in the collecting yard and the cows coming into the milking parlour. Those are the times when a lungworm infection becomes quite clear and the coughing is more clear for those cows that have the infection. You can choose to treat individual cows. Ideally, you would do that with an injection with epinephrine, or you can elect to treat the entire herd, assuming that all cows have been exposed. And in that scenario, you can use the injectable form or a pour-on. Many herds will claim that the initial treatment for lungworm, be it a pour-on or injection, may not be as successful. Quite often, this can be because lungworm itself has actually been in the herd for a little bit longer. The coughing has been going on for quite some time, and so the lungworm infection is actually very well established. The treatment that is being given will be successful. At the moment, we don't have any reason to believe that lungworm has formed resistance against the anthelmintic treatments that are allowed in milking cows. However, if using a pour-on, remember, there is a delay between the treatment being given and the actual active ingredient reaching the level or the concentration inside the animal that is lethal to these worms. So that will add a few days, maybe even up to a week, of coughing cows before worms start being killed. During the warmer but also wetter times of the year, lungworm has a fairly short life cycle and could be as short as only 2 weeks. That way, cows going in a rotational grazing system may come into a paddock that they first picked up lungworm, and then in the next round of grazing come into that same paddock and are exposed to the next wave of lungworm. That could mean that subsequent waves of lungworm follow without a break in the coughing in cows. Even though treatment was successful, it feels as if the cows never stopped coughing. And plenty of herds that experience this go in with a second treatment, be it a pour-on or an injection of a epinephrine containing product. The second treatment seems to be working very well, and often it's blamed on the first product not having worked. But actually, what is usually the underlying cause is that the worm burden in the cows and on the paddocks was of such a degree that the treatment, even though successful, never actually managed to give the cows a full relief of lungworm. Now, that's what you can do right now if the issues arise with lungworm in cows. But looking ahead to maybe next year, there are a few things you can do to prevent lungworm from becoming as big an issue as it may have been this year. What we often notice is that in herds where lungworm becomes a problem, it initially starts with the first lactation animals. So that would be the group of animals that I would really look at for the prevention of this disease. Older stock will have developed a level of immunity that will allow them to cope with your general level of lungworm exposure on the farm. It is those first lactation animals that may have not built up that immunity. They pick up an infection and allow the worm to fully complete its process and have a full-blown lungworm infection in those animals. They then recontaminate the paddocks to a higher degree than what the older cows are used to, and thus overcoming maybe the cow's immune system's ability to fight off the normal level of infection. And then from the first lactation cows, it seems to then move forward and affect the older cows in the herd. So again, let's focus on those first lactation cows. Where were those cows in a previous grazing season? So as maiden heifers, were they out on an out farm? Were they contract reared? Maybe where they were grazing, there was no lungworm. So those animals were never allowed to build up a level of immunity that will help them cope with the level of lungworm that they might encounter on the home farm on the grazing platform for the dairy herd. If you're not sure how much exposure your maiden heifers have had, there is a way of vaccinating those animals before they are exposed to lungworm on the dairy herd's grazing platform. It's a vaccine called HuskVac, and it needs to be administered before the start of the grazing season ideally, but definitely before the lungworm risk period starts in, let's say, May. But the assumption is that as animals spend more time in the dairy herd, they will build up their own immunity. So really focus on those maiden heifers, first lactation cows for the HuskVac vaccine. If animals still present with coughing after a successful treatment, there really needs to be given consideration to this not being a lungworm issue, especially if it's individual cows that are within the herd that remain coughing. These cows could actually have developed a real pneumonia, be it from Pasteurella, maybe a mycoplasma. But that is something that needs to be explored further. Not all coughing during the summer is lungworm coughing. If you want any more information on that topic, please talk to your local Glanbia representative or log on to glanbiaconnect.com.